I wish the thing we use the ASI for is to like, cure the diseases and do all the good in the world. But it is my prediction that sort of like in the end game, what will be at stake will not just be kind of cool products, but whether liberal democracy survives, like whether the CCP survives, like what the world order for the next century will be. And when that is at stake, forces will be activated that are sort of way beyond what we're talking about now. And like, in the sort of like crazy race at the end, like the sort of national security implications will be the most important. Sort of like, World War II. It's like, nuclear energy had its day, but in the initial kind of period when this technology was first discovered, you had to stabilize the situation, you had to get nukes, you had to do it right. And then the civilian applications had their day. I think people talk about AGI and they're always just talking about the private AI labs. And I think I just really want to challenge that assumption. It just seems pretty likely to me, as we've talked about, for reasons we've talked about, that look, like the national security state is going to get involved. And I think there's a lot of ways this could look like, right? Is it like nationalization? Is it a public-private partnership? Is it a kind of defense contractor-like relationship? Is it a sort of government project that soaks up all the people? And so there's a spectrum there. But I think people are just vastly underrating the chances of this more or less looking like a government project. When we have like literal superintelligence on our cluster, right? And it's like, you have 1 billion like superintelligent scientists that they can like hack everything. They can like Stuxnet the Chinese data centers. They're starting to build the robo armies. You really think that'll be like a private company and the government would be like, oh my God, what is going on?
Even backing up, like what is it we're trying to, why do we want to win against China? We want to win against China because we don't want a top-down authoritarian system to win. Yep. Now, if the way to beat that is that the most important technology that humanity will have has to be controlled by a top-down government, like what was the point? Like why? Let's like run our cards with privatization. That's the way we get to this classic liberal market-based system we want for the ASIs.
Yeah. All right. So a lot to talk about here. Yeah. I think maybe I'll start a bit about like actually looking at what the private world would look like, and I think this is part of where the sort of there's no alternative comes from. And then let's look at like what the government project looks like, what checks and balances look like, and so on. All right. Private world. I mean, first of all, okay, so, right, like a lot of people right now talk about open source. And I think there's this sort of misconception that like AGI development is going to be like, oh, it's going to be some like beautiful decentralized thing. And, some giddy community of coders who gets to collaborate on it. That's not how it's going to look like, right? It's, the $100 billion, $1 trillion cluster. It's not going to be that many people that have it. The algorithms, it's like right now, open source is kind of good because people just use the stuff that was published. And so they basically, the algorithms were published, or, as Mistral, they just kind of like leave DeepMind and, take all the secrets with them and they just kind of replicate it. But that's not going to continue being the case. And so, the sort of like open source alternative, I mean, also people say stuff like, 1026 flops, it'll be in my phone, or, no, it won't. It's like Moore's law is really slow. I mean, AI chips are getting better, but like, the $100 billion computer will not cost, like $1,000, within your lifetime or whatever, aside from AI. So anyway, so it's going to be like 2 or 3, big players on the private world. And so look, a few things. So first of all, you talk about the sort of like, enormous power that sort of superintelligence will have and that the government will have. I think it's pretty plausible that the alternative world is that like one AI company has that power, right? And especially if we're talking about lead, it's like what? I don't know, OpenAI has a 6-month lead. And then, so then you're talking about basically, the most powerful weapon ever. And it's, you're kind of making this like radical bet on like a private company CEO as the benevolent dictator.
No, this is not necessarily like any other thing that's privatized. We don't count on them being benevolent. We just look to think of, for example, somebody who manufactures industrial fertilizer. Yes. Right. The person with this factory. If they went back to an ancient civilization, they could like blow up Rome. Yep. They could probably blow up Washington, D.C.
Indeed.
And I think people sort of underrate that there are actually a lot of private actors who have the ability to like, there's a lot of people who control the water supply or whatever. Sure. And we can count on cooperation and market-based incentives to basically keep a balance of power. Sure. I get that things are proceeding really fast. Yeah, so but we have a lot of historical evidence that this is the thing that works best.
I mean, what do we do with nukes, right? The way we keep the sort of nukes in check is not like, a sort of beefed up Second Amendment where like each state has their own like little nuclear arsenal and like, Dario and Sam have their own little nuclear arsenal. No, it's like, it's institutions, it's constitutions, it's laws, it's courts. So anyway, I'm not sure that this, I'm not sure that the sort of balance of power analogy holds. In fact, sort of the government having the biggest guns was sort of like an enormous civilizational achievement, right? Like Landfrieden in the sort of Holy Roman Empire, right? If somebody from the town over kind of committed a crime on you, you didn't kind of start a sort of a big battle between the two towns. No, you take it to a court of the Holy Roman Empire, and they would decide. And it's a big achievement. Now, the thing about the industrial fertilizer, I think the key difference is kind of speed and offense-defense balance issues, right? So it's like 20th century and 10 years in a few years. That is an incredibly scary period. And it is incredibly scary, because it's, you're going through just this sort of enormous array of destructive technology and this sort of like enormous amount of like, basically military advance. I mean, you would have gone from, kind of like, bayonets and horses to kind of like tank armies and fighter jets in like a couple of years. And then from, and then to like, nukes and, ICBMs and stuff, just like in a matter of years. And so it is sort of that speed that creates, I think basically the way I think about it is there's going to be this initial, just incredibly volatile, incredibly dangerous period. And somehow we have to make it through that. And that's going to be incredibly challenging. That's where you need the kind of government project. If you can make it through that, then you kind of go to like, now the situation has been stabilized. We don't face this imminent national security threat. It's like, yes, there were kind of WMDs that came along the way, but either we've managed to kind of like have a sort of stable offense defense balance, right? Like I think bioweapons initially are a huge issue, right? Like an attacker can just create like 1,000 different synthetic, viruses and spread them. And it's like going to be really hard for you to kind of like make a defense against each. But maybe at some point you figure out the kind of like, universal defense against every possible virus. And then you're in a stable situation again on the offense defense balance. Or you do the thing, you do with planes where there's like, there's certain capabilities that the private sector isn't allowed to have. And you've like figured out what's going on, restrict those. And then you can kind of like let the sort of civilian uses.
So I'm skeptical of this because there's.
And then, I mean, the other important thing is, so I talked about the sort of, maybe it's like, it's one company with all this power. And I think it is unprecedented because it's like the industrial fertilizer guy cannot overthrow the US government. I think it's quite plausible that like the AI company with super intelligence can overthrow the US government. But
there'll be multiple AI companies, right? And I buy that one of them could be ahead.
So it's not obvious that it'll be multiple. I think it's, again, if there's like a 6-month lead, maybe there's 2 or 3.
I agree.
Sorry, but if there's 2 or 3, then what you have is just like a crazy race between these 2 or 3 companies. It's like, whatever, Demis and Sam, they're just like, I don't want to let the other one win. And they're both developing their nuclear arsenals and it's just like, also like, come on, the government is not going to let these people, are they going to let like, is Dario going to be the one developing the kind of like, super hacking Stuxnet and like deploying against the Chinese data center? The other issue though, is it won't just, if it's 2 or 3, it won't just be 2 or 3. There'll be 2 or 3 and it'll be China and Russia and North Korea because in the private lab world, there is no way they'll have security that is good enough.
Okay, I agree that like I'm worried if Sam or Dario have a 1-year lead on ASI and that in that world, then I'm like concerned about this being privatized. But in that exact same world, I'm very concerned about Donald Trump having the capability. Mm-hmm. And potentially if we're living in a world where the takeoff is slower than you anticipate, in that world, I'm like very much, I want the private companies. So like in no part of this matrix is it obviously true that the government-led project is better than the private project. Let's talk
about the government project a little bit and checks and balances. In some sense, I think my argument is a sort of Burkean argument, which is like American checks and balances have held for, over 200 years and through crazy technological revolutions. The U.S. military could kill like every civilian in the United States.
You're going to make that argument. The private-public balance of power has held for hundreds of years. And then
corporate, but yeah, why has it held? Because the government has the biggest guns. And as never before has a single CEO or a random nonprofit board had the ability to launch nukes. The United States national security state is going to be intimately involved with this. And this will, the labs, whether, and I think, again, the government, a lot of what I think is the government project looks like, it is basically a joint venture between like, the cloud providers, between some of the labs and the government. And so I think there is no world in which the government isn't intimately involved in this like crazy period. At the very least, basically, like the intelligence agencies need to be running security for these labs. So they're already kind of like, they're controlling everything. They're controlling access to everything. Then they're going to be like, probably again, if we're in this like really volatile international situation, like a lot of the initial applications, it'll suck. It's not what I want to use ASI for. We'll be like trying to somehow stabilize this crazy situation. Somehow we need to prevent like proliferation of like some crazy new WMDs and like the undermining of mutually assured destruction to kind of like, North Korea and Russia and China. And so I think, I basically think your world, I think there's much more spectrum than you're acknowledging here. And I think basically the world in which it's private labs is like extremely heavy government involvement. And really what we're debating is like, what form of government project, but it is going to look much more like, the national security state than anything it does look like a startup as it is right now.
Look, I think something like that makes sense. Yeah. I would be, if it's like the Manhattan Project, then I'm very worried, where it's like, this is part of the US military. Where if it's more like, listen, you got to talk to Jake Sullivan before you run the next training line.
Is like Lockheed Martin Skunk Works part of the U.S. military? It's like they call the shots.
Yeah, I don't think that's great. I think that's bad. I think it would be bad if that happened with ASI.
What is the alternative?
Okay, so it's closer to my end of the spectrum where, you do have to talk to Jake Sullivan before you can launch the next training cluster.
Yeah.
But there's many companies who are still going for it.
Yeah.
And the government will be intimately involved in the security. But the AI is still broadly deployed, and alignment works in the sense that you can make sure that it's not, the system level prompt is like, you can't help people make bioweapons or something.
Sure. I mean, I expect the AIs to be broadly deployed. I mean, first of all,
even if it's a government project.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think first of all, I think the Metas of the world, open sourcing their eyes, that are 2 years behind or whatever. Yeah, super valuable role. They're gonna and so there's gonna be some question of either the offense defense balance is fine, and so even if they open source 2-year-old AIs, it's fine, or it's there's some restrictions on the most extreme dual use capabilities, you don't let private companies sell kind of crazy weapons, and that's great, and that will help with the diffusion. I mean, I think the sort of alignment angle during the intelligence explosion, it's gonna, it's not a process of years of bureaucracy and then you can kind of write some standards. I think it looks much more like basically a war, and you have a fog of war. It's look, it's is it safe to do the next and it's we're 3 into the intelligence explosion. We don't really understand what's going on anymore. A bunch of our generalization scaling curves are kind of looking not great. Some of our automated AI researchers that are doing alignment are saying it's fine, but we don't quite trust them. In this test, the AI started doing naughty things, and but then we hammered it out and then it was fine. And should we go ahead? Should we take, another 6 months? Also, by the way, China just stole the weights, or they're about to deploy the robot army. What do we do? I think it is this crazy situation. Basically you're relying much more on kind of a sane chain of command than you are on sort of some deliberative regulatory scheme. I wish you were able to do the deliberative regulatory scheme. And this is the thing about the private companies too. I don't think, they'll claim they're going to do safety, but I think it's really rough when you're in the commercial race and they're startups, and startups are startups. I think they're not fit to handle WMDs.